Hi folks, welcome to Philosophy According to Eddie, and this session is going to be on the ontological argument. The ontological argument actually predates the teleological and cosmological arguments in terms of when they were written. The ontological argument was an attempt to prove God's existence while we were still on earth. The problem that came about for many Christians was that God and his existence couldn't be proven while we were alive. And so some thinkers, using the a priori approach, such as St. Anselm of Canterbury, figured that they would try to prove God a priori, rationally. Prove God's existence from his very definition. And this has led to a big debate as to whether this can actually be done, or are you trying to do the old classic trick of defining it into existence. St. Anselm, René Descartes are in favour of the ontological argument, whereas Galileo and Immanuel Kant are against it. St. Anselm of Canterbury, who lived from 1033 till 1109, was the guy who came up with the ontological argument, although the name was actually given by Kant at a later point. Anselm has his personal motto of credo ut intelligam. Now, he spoke and wrote in Latin because that was how religious and educated people wrote at the time. And that means, I believe, in order to understand. It is his theory that in order to understand God, you have to believe in him, rather than in order to believe in him, you have to understand him, which seems to be a more modern interpretation. He wrote Proslogion, a very long prayer, and in chapters 2 and 3, he tries to use traditional Christian beliefs in order to explain why God must necessarily exist sheerly through his own definition, or Christianity's definition of God. Anselm's first argument in chapter 2 is relatively brief but very straightforward. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Basically, you cannot imagine anything greater than God. God is the most great thing you could possibly imagine. And a real God has got to be better than a God that doesn't exist. Things that are real have got to be better than the equivalent thing that doesn't exist. Think world of forms and divided line. The imagined is below the object which actually exists, but the perfect form is above it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, watch the Plato video. It'll make more sense. So the idea is, a real God is better than a God that doesn't exist. And God, as we know him, cannot be any greater than anything else. It's got to be the greatest being. So, in order for it to be the greatest being we could possibly think of, it has to exist. Because otherwise, if it didn't exist, it wouldn't be the greatest being to be thought of. As such, to suggest that God is not real is a logical contradiction. Because for God to be perfect, God has to be real. End of. Now, this is quite difficult to immediately rationalise. Something feels immediately wrong about it, and it's most likely to be, well, you can't just define something into existence, surely. We could think of a mermaid and claim that exists just because we can think of it. And Anselm would say, no, that's not the same. A mermaid, we know it doesn't exist. If we think in our mind, this is something which we know does not exist, and like a unicorn, or that might exist, then by definition it is a creature that doesn't exist or might exist. So therefore, to claim that it's real would be wrong. because its definition, the definition of a mermaid, is a creature that doesn't exist. And so it would be a fool who knows that the definition of God is that God is the greatest thing that can be thought of, but does not believe in God. Because the definition of God is that God is the greatest thing, and existence is part of being the greatest thing. It's a relatively strong logical train of thought. And chapter 3 supports chapter 2 with a different slant on it. Chapter 3 of Proslogion suggests that God cannot be thought not to be. And that's a slightly confusing phrase. But the way to think of it is this. Humans can exist or can not exist. So this little grid here, the big tick and the big cross are about existence, the little tick and the little cross are about possibility. So possible to exist, possible not to exist. That's us as humans. We're contingent. We could exist, we could not exist. So these are sort of impossible things like square circle, logical fallacy. However, there's things that can't exist, as opposed to things that can exist and cannot exist. But necessary beings like God can't not exist. God must be necessary because God is perfect, and therefore can't not exist, because the possibility to exist and not exist, being contingent, reduces you to be imperfect. Gaunilla of Marmoutier, a monk, wrote in behalf of the fool in order to try to oppose Anselm's argument. Now, as a monk, he obviously was Christian. However, he did not accept the ontological argument. This goes to show that not only do not all Christians believe the same thing, some of them disbelieve some of the theories that are put forward for the existence of God. Gaunilla suggests a perfect island. Surely, for this island to be perfect, it must exist, because existence is better than not existence. But this is ridiculous. The idea that you can think of a perfect island and therefore it just pops up somewhere, that can't work. So therefore, the idea of a perfect island is absurd, therefore defining God into existence is also absurd. Anselm wrote a very considered response to this and suggested that we're forgetting that an island is contingent. It is possible to be, it is possible not to be. Islands, however, are not impossible not to be. They are not necessary. So as an island is contingent, we cannot define it into existence because its definition doesn't include existence as a contingent being. Only necessary beings can be defined into existence because they can't not exist. Hick built on Gaunilla's criticism by suggesting with the perfect island that how could you ever reach perfection? Could you not keep adding on a grain of sand and a grain of sand, making it more and more perfect until it becomes a continent? As such, can we not constantly improve on God? However, again, Anselm would argue that this is misunderstanding the nature of God. God cannot be improved upon further. It would be a logical mistake. Another criticism that Anselm approached at this stage was to explain the difference between speaking of something and understanding it, or making sense. He's responding to the idea that how could a fool, how could anyone in fact, say God doesn't exist if God is so perfect that he can't not exist? Surely they would be unable to say God doesn't exist because it would be so perfectly obvious that God exists. And here Anselm suggests that is because these people are not, they're foolish, they are fools. they are speaking of things they do not understand and do not make sense. The fool doesn't understand God. By saying God doesn't exist, the fool doesn't understand that God cannot be anything but a perfect necessary being. It would be as if I were to say this 8-dimensional art piece is better than this 3-dimensional art piece. I can make the statement, but I'm not showing any kind of sensible understanding of what this means. It's impossible for an art piece in our world to be 8-dimensional. However, Aquinas does go against this and suggests that actually self-evidence in our world has to be observable. We can't just say it is self-evident for God to exist because he's a necessary being. We have to actually be able to observe that somehow. We can observe that a square must have 4 sides. We can observe that all bachelors are male. We knew it a priori, but we still can observe it. By not being able to observe God's essence, what God is actually made of, this argument cannot work. Descartes attempted to build upon Anselm's argument to defend it further, just like Malcolm, Plantinga and Smith did in the 20th and 21st centuries. Descartes suggests God is perfect, and therefore a perfect God must contain all perfect properties. To be perfect, you have to have all subdivisions of perfect, including perfect existence. As God is perfect, God must include perfect existence and therefore must exist. He also suggests existence is a defining predicate of God, and therefore it must exist. Now, a predicate is a descriptor. My tie is made of red silk. The is made of red silk bit is a predicate. It gives us information about my tie. Existence is a predicate of God, and it's a predicate that is within its definition. God must, by definition, exist. And so, therefore, God exists. Otherwise, it wouldn't be God, it would be like God. Now, Kant suggests that this is a fallacy. He suggests that it is not impossible to reject a statement and all of its predicates. You could say, I do not believe in God, and it would make logical sense. It would not be contradictory. And if it's not contradictory, then it can't be a priori logic. If you said, I don't believe in triangles, then we could go, well, hold on, no, I can work that out a priori. That can't work. However, you could say, I don't believe in God, and throw away all of the predicates that go with it, and it wouldn't be a logical contradiction. You could say, if God exists, then he must necessarily exist. He's not contingent. But you could also say, but I don't believe he exists in the first place. It would be the same as saying, I do not believe in mermaids, and I do not believe in half women, half fish. Half woman, half fish is the predicate. Mermaid is the thing in question. We are getting rid of both of those together. We're saying, I don't believe in mermaids, I don't believe in half women, half fish. Gone. He also says existence is not a predicate. It doesn't add anything. If I say my tie is red, that's a predicate. If I say my tie is made of silk, that's also a predicate. It gives us 2 bits of information. If I say my tie exists, it doesn't change anything. It doesn't make us think differently about the tie. He suggests, imagine 100 thalers. Now, thalers were a currency in medieval Europe. Imagine 100 thalers, and imagine that there is in fact a pile of 100 thalers in front of you. If there were 100 thalers in front of you, and you can imagine 100 thalers, they are both conceptually the same. One cannot be described in any way different to the other as being significantly different. They are essentially the same, it's just that one exists and one doesn't. And therefore existence is not a predicate. It's a property, but it is not a predicate. It doesn't give more information. So there you have it. That's the ontological argument. We've looked at St. Anselm and Descartes in favour. We've looked at Galileo and Kant in opposition. If you have any questions, of course, let me know. It'd be a good idea to compare this to the cosmological and teleological arguments from experience. Thanks for watching. See you next time.